The bell's third toll had barely faded when her father's calloused hand clamped around Evelyn's wrist like iron shackles. The entire marketplace froze. Merchants paused mid-haggle, children stopped chasing chickens between the stalls, and even old Martha's perpetually gossiping tongue fell silent. The ancient pact summons echoed across the dusty square like a death knell, and every soul present knew what those three deliberate chimes meant. "This girl!" her father bellowed, his voice cutting through the suffocating silence as he yanked her forward, "has brought shame upon our family name for the last time." His weathered face twisted with something that might have been grief if it weren't so obviously calculated. "By the ancient pact, I surrender her to the Lord of the Heights as payment for her disgrace." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. The opaque stone pendant at her throat, her mother's last gift, seemed to burn against her skin as hundreds of eyes turned toward her like daggers. She had always known this moment might come. For 22 years, she had endured the whispers, the pointed stares, the way conversations died when she approached the baker's counter or tried to buy thread at the weaving shop. Her crime was existing in a body the village deemed unworthy, carrying weight they considered shameful, taking up space they begrudged her. But hearing it proclaimed publicly, watching her father trade her away like spoiled grain, felt like drowning in broad daylight. The murmurs started low, a ripple of blessed crosses and barely concealed satisfaction from the women who had spent years cataloging her perceived failures. "About time," someone hissed. That family needed to pay their debts. Others clicked their tongues with false sympathy, while their eyes gleamed with the particular cruelty reserved for watching someone else's child be offered up like a sacrificial lamb. Evelyn's throat constricted. She had always spoken softly, always kept her head down, always tried to make herself small enough to slip through their judgment unnoticed. Now, standing in the center of their collective condemnation, she felt exposed as raw meat thrown to wolves. Her fingers instinctively clutched the stone pendant, smooth, warm, and utterly ordinary, except for the intricate coat of arms etched into its surface. The only thing her mother had left behind besides recipes and half-finished herb gardens. The air grew cold with unnatural swiftness. From the hilltop that dominated the village like a brooding giant, a carriage materialized as if conjured from shadow itself. Black wood gleamed despite the lack of sunlight, and not a sound marked its descent down the winding path. No creaking wheels, no horse hooves striking stone, no jangling harness. It simply appeared and glided forward with the inevitability of a funeral procession. Even the bravest villagers stepped back as the carriage halted at the square's edge. The door swung open without anyone touching it, releasing a wave of air so frigid that breath became visible fog. From within that darkness emerged a figure cloaked in midnight fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Lord of the Heights, the one ancient whispers called Vampire Alpha, moved with fluid grace across the cobblestones, each step measured and deliberate. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. This was it. This was how her story ended. Not with love or achievement or even simple acceptance, but as currency in a bargain she had no part in making. She forced herself to meet his approach with what dignity she could salvage, even as her hands trembled and her knees threatened betrayal. But when he stopped before her, something impossible happened. Instead of claiming his prize with the cold indifference of a debt collector, the Lord of the Heights studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. His features remained obscured by the deep hood, but she felt his gaze like a physical touch, not invasive or hungry, but searching, as if he were looking for something specific and had somehow found it. "You choose poorly," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square despite its quiet tone. The words were directed at her father, but his attention never wavered from Evelyn's face. "This is not payment. This is not punishment." He paused, and in that silence the very air seemed to hold its breath. "This is recognition." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Recognition? What could the Lord of the Heights possibly recognize in the village's most scorned daughter? Evelyn herself felt reality tilt sideways. Nothing in the stories prepared her for this moment, for being seen rather than simply taken. "I do not accept offerings made in anger or desperation," the Lord continued, still speaking to her father while somehow addressing her directly. "The ancient pact requires consent freely given, not flesh sold in the marketplace like livestock." His tone carried centuries of authority, the kind of power that made kings bow and mountains move aside. "If this woman chooses to come with me, she will come as an equal. If she refuses, she remains free to refuse." The world stopped spinning entirely. Evelyn had spent her entire life being told what she was worth, which was nothing, and who she belonged to, which was no one who truly wanted her. Now this figure of legend and nightmare was offering her something she had never possessed: choice. The very concept felt foreign on her tongue, like trying to speak a language she had only heard in dreams. Her father's face turned purple with outrage. "The pact is sealed. The bells have rung. You cannot simply—" "I can," the Lord of the Heights interrupted with lethal calm, "because I am the one who sealed it. 5 centuries ago, when your ancestors begged protection from the plague that swept these lands, I accepted their covenant. But never did I agree to collect human debris as tribute." His words fell like hammer blows, each one striking her father's protest into silence. "The pact protects this village from threats beyond your comprehension. It does not make me a collector of unwanted daughters." Evelyn's throat worked soundlessly. Part of her wanted to collapse with relief. She was free, truly free to walk away from this humiliation and start over somewhere else. But another part, the part that had spent 22 years swallowing insults and nursing secret dreams of proving them all wrong, whispered something different, something dangerous. What if she said yes? "I need time to consider," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible over the crowd's agitated buzzing. It was the first time she had ever asked for anything publicly, and the words felt like swallowing broken glass. But she had said them. She had claimed space for her own decision in this moment that was supposed to be about everyone else's convenience. The Lord of the Heights inclined his hooded head with something that might have been approval. "Time you shall have. When the moon rises full tomorrow night, if you choose to come, walk to the hilltop alone. If you choose to remain, no further summons will disturb your peace." He turned toward the carriage, then paused. "But know this, Evelyn of the Stone Pendant, your mother once served as counselor in these very negotiations. You carry more of her wisdom than you know." The shock of hearing her mother mentioned, her mother who had died when Evelyn was barely 16, and whom no one ever spoke of except in carefully neutral tones, nearly sent her stumbling backward. How could he possibly know about her mother? How did he even know her name? But before she could voice any questions, the Lord of the Heights had returned to his carriage. The door closed without sound, and the vehicle began its impossible silent ascent back to the heights. Only when it disappeared entirely did the normal sounds of the world return: creaking cartwheels, bleating goats, the rustle of wind through the market stall's canvas covers. The crowd began to disperse with the awkward shuffle of people who had witnessed something they didn't fully understand. Some shot venomous looks at her father, clearly displeased that the expected entertainment had been cut short. Others stared at Evelyn with new speculation, as if seeing her for the first time and finding the view confusing. Her father grabbed her arm again, but gentler now, aware that the game had changed and he no longer held all the cards. "What did he mean about your mother?" he hissed in her ear. "What haven't you told me?" "I don't know," Evelyn replied honestly, but something in her chest had begun to burn with a heat she had never felt before. It wasn't anger exactly, or even hope. It was possibility. For the first time in her life, someone with real power had looked at her and seen potential instead of problems. The walk home passed in tense silence. Their small house sat at the edge of the village proper, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough away to make the distance obvious. The herb garden her mother had planted still struggled along, despite years of minimal care, and the small mill that provided their modest income creaked in the afternoon breeze like old bones. Inside, her father paced the narrow kitchen while Evelyn sank into her mother's old chair by the window. The wooden seat had worn smooth under years of use, shaped by a woman who had apparently possessed secrets she never shared with her daughter. Evelyn's fingers found the stone pendant again, tracing the familiar coat of arms that had always seemed like mere decoration. "You cannot seriously be considering his offer," her father said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The public rebuke had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. "The man is a monster. Stories say he drinks blood and steals souls. Stories also say he protects this village," Evelyn replied quietly. It was perhaps the first time in her adult life that she had directly contradicted her father, and the words felt strange in her mouth. "Stories say the ancient pact has kept us safe for 500 years. Stories say many things, but they also said I would be taken as punishment, and that didn't happen either." Her father's pacing stopped abruptly. "What's gotten into you? You've never spoken back like this before." That was true. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the one who absorbed criticism without complaint and worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Even when he decided to trade her away like damaged goods, her first instinct had been to accept it quietly and try to find dignity in sacrifice. But something had shifted when the Lord of the Heights spoke her name. Not just her given name, but her name paired with her most treasured possession, as if he understood its significance. And the mention of her mother had unlocked a door in her mind she hadn't even realized existed. "Maybe I should have spoken back sooner," she said softly, still staring out the window toward the distant hilltop where the manor house waited like a dark promise. "Maybe Mother would have wanted me to." Her father's face went pale. In all the years since her mother's death, they had maintained a careful silence about the woman who had once filled this house with laughter and the scent of healing herbs. It was easier to pretend she had simply faded away from illness rather than examine what they might have lost when she died, or what secrets she might have taken with her. "Your mother," he said carefully, "was a good woman who knew her place. She would never have wanted you to associate with creatures of darkness." But even as he spoke, Evelyn could see doubt creeping into his expression. Because the truth was, none of them really knew what her mother would have wanted. The fever had taken her so quickly that there hadn't been time for final conversations or deathbed wisdom. Just herbs pressed into Evelyn's young hands and a whispered instruction to "remember who you truly are" that had never made sense until today. Night fell with unusual swiftness, as if the day were eager to surrender to whatever came next. Evelyn lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to her father's restless movements in the next room. The stone pendant lay warm against her throat, and for the first time in years, she found herself really looking at the coat of arms etched into its surface. It showed two hands clasped beneath a crown, with small symbols around the border that might have been letters in a language she didn't recognize. She had always assumed it was decorative, but now she wondered if it meant something specific, something her mother had wanted her to remember when the time was right. Tomorrow night, she would have to choose. She could remain in the village, endure the whispers and pointed looks for the rest of her life, and eventually fade away as thoroughly as her mother had. Safe, predictable, small. Or she could walk up that hill and discover what the Lord of the Heights saw when he looked at her, what recognition he claimed to have found in her face. The very thought terrified her, but it also made her blood sing with something she had never experienced before: anticipation. Outside her window, the manor house on the hill glowed with warm lamplight against the star-studded sky, waiting, patient as stone and twice as permanent, but somehow no longer quite as forbidding as it had always seemed. For the first time since childhood, Evelyn fell asleep without tears on her cheeks, but what happened in those dreams would change everything she thought she knew about herself, her mother, and the true nature of the ancient pact that bound her village to the Lord of the Heights. The dream came like a flood of memories that weren't her own. Evelyn found herself standing in the same kitchen where she now slept, but the walls gleamed with fresh paint and herbs hung in fragrant bundles from every rafter. A woman with her own dark hair and gentle hands moved between the shelves, grinding dried flowers into powder while humming a melody that made Evelyn's heart ache with recognition. "The pendants are more than decoration, little star," the woman said, without turning around, her voice carrying the same cadence Evelyn remembered from childhood lullabies. "They're promises made in lamplight, witnessed by those who understand the weight of true consent. Your father thinks I tend gardens, but I tend agreements. I tend the delicate balance that keeps monsters and men from devouring each other. In the dream, Evelyn tried to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions that burned in her throat. But her mother turned with eyes full of urgent love and pressed something into her palm. Not the stone pendant, but a small leather journal bound with red cord. When the time comes for choosing, her mother whispered, remember that the strongest negotiations come from those who have learned to value themselves. The Lord of the Heights sees what others miss because he has spent centuries watching people throw away their most precious gifts out of fear. Don't let them make you small, Evelyn. Don't let them convince you that survival means surrendering your voice. The dream shattered like glass against morning light. Evelyn woke with tears on her cheeks and the absolute certainty that she was going to climb that hill tonight. Consequences be damned. The phantom weight of the journal still pressed against her palm, and she spent the early hours searching every corner of the house until she found it, tucked behind loose boards in her mother's old bedroom, exactly where dream logic suggested it would be. The pages were filled with her mother's careful handwriting, but not recipes or household accounts as Evelyn had expected. Instead, she found detailed notes about village disputes, carefully documented agreements between families, and page after page of what could only be described as diplomatic correspondence. Letters discussing water rights, trade routes, crop failures, and the delicate art of mediating between human needs and supernatural protections. Her mother had been the village's unofficial negotiator, the woman people turned to when conflicts needed resolution and pride needed saving. And according to the journal's final entries, she had been specifically preparing Evelyn to take on that role when she came of age. E shows natural instinct for reading between words, one entry noted. Yesterday she mediated argument between baker's sons without taking sides or diminishing either position. Must teach her the formal protocols before the summer assembly. The summer assembly that had never happened because fever had claimed her mother that spring. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read page after page of observations about her own childhood behavior, her tendency to listen before speaking, her instinct to find solutions that let everyone save face, her unusual ability to remain calm when emotions ran high. Traits her father had dismissed as mere passivity were revealed as carefully nurtured diplomatic skills. The final entry, dated 3 days before her mother's death, made Evelyn's breath catch entirely. The Lord of the Heights has requested meeting to discuss E's future role. Pendant ready for formal presentation. Must ensure she understands that consent in supernatural negotiations requires absolute clarity. No room for assumption or obligation. She must choose this path freely or not at all. Her strength will come from knowing she can always walk away. The words blurred as tears spilled freely down Evelyn's cheeks. Her mother had been grooming her for exactly this moment, this choice. And somehow the Lord of the Heights had been part of that preparation, had been waiting 16 years for her to be ready. She spent the day in a strange, suspended state between terror and anticipation. The village buzzed with speculation about the previous day's events, but she avoided the marketplace entirely, choosing instead to walk the familiar paths through her mother's herb garden. The plants her father claimed were merely decorative revealed themselves under closer inspection to be sophisticated arrangements. Protective herbs near the house boundaries, calming varieties near the gates, and a carefully tended patch of moon-blooming flowers that only opened after dark. Everything had been preparation. Every skill her mother had taught her. Every story about the importance of keeping one's word. Every lesson about listening more than speaking. All of it had been building toward this night. As twilight approached, Evelyn bathed with the special soap her mother had made from lavender and salt, then dressed in the one good dress she owned, deep blue wool that brought out her eyes and had been her mother's before becoming hers. She braided her hair simply and settled the stone pendant at the hollow of her throat where it belonged. Her father waited by the kitchen door as she prepared to leave, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been fear for her safety. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Whatever your mother planned, whatever that creature promised, you could still choose differently. We could leave the village, start over somewhere the pact doesn't reach. For a moment, Evelyn wavered. The offer was tempting. A clean slate, freedom from whispers and judgment, the safety of anonymity. But it would also mean abandoning the only home she had ever known, and more importantly, walking away from the chance to finally understand who she truly was beneath all the shame others had heaped upon her. "Mother chose this path for me," she said softly. "She chose it, knowing exactly who I was and what I might become. I owe it to her memory to see what she saw." The walk to the hilltop took longer than expected, partly because the path was steeper than it appeared from below, and partly because her legs kept threatening to give out entirely from nervous energy. The manor house grew larger with each step, revealing itself to be far more elegant than the sinister fortress she had imagined from a distance. Warm light spilled from tall windows, and she could see gardens that looked carefully tended rather than wildly overgrown. The front door opened before she could knock. A woman emerged, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested she had been ordering people around successfully for decades. She wore simple black clothing that somehow managed to look more expensive than the village priest's finest robes, and her sharp eyes assessed Evelyn with the thoroughness of someone evaluating a potentially valuable acquisition. "Lady Evelyn," she said with a slight bow that felt more respectful than mocking. "I am Helena, housekeeper and administrator of this estate. Lord Adrian is waiting in the library, but first, there are protocols you should understand." Adrian. After all these years of thinking of him as simply the Lord of the Heights, he had a name that sounded almost normal. Evelyn followed Helena through a foyer decorated with tapestries that seemed to tell stories in threads of silver and gold, down a corridor lined with portraits of people from various historical periods, and into a sitting room where a fire crackled cheerfully in an enormous stone fireplace. "The master of this house," Helena began without preamble, settling into a chair and gesturing for Evelyn to do the same, "operates under certain restrictions that govern all his interactions with humans. He cannot enter any space without explicit invitation. He cannot form binding agreements without clear and repeated consent from all parties. He cannot take sustenance from any person who has not freely offered it through proper ritual. These are not merely his preferences. They are supernatural laws that cannot be broken without severe consequences." Evelyn found herself leaning forward with genuine interest. The formal structure reminded her of her mother's journal entries, the careful documentation of agreements and boundaries. "What kind of consequences?" she asked. "The loss of everything that makes him more than a mindless predator," Helena replied matter-of-factly. "The ancient pact protects your village, but it also protects you from him should he ever overstep the boundaries of consent. He is quite literally unable to harm someone who has not invited harm, just as he is unable to help someone who refuses assistance." This revelation shifted something fundamental in Evelyn's understanding. The Lord of the Heights, Adrian, wasn't just choosing to be honorable in his dealings with humans. He was bound by laws that made any other behavior impossible. "Your mother understood these restrictions," Helena continued, pouring tea from a service that appeared to be genuine silver. "She helped establish many of the current protocols during her time as mediator. Lord Adrian held her in the highest regard, not merely as a negotiator, but as someone who grasped the true complexity of supernatural human relations." "She never told me," Evelyn whispered. "I knew she helped resolve disputes in the village, but I had no idea she worked directly with—" She gestured vaguely at the elegant room around them. "She was protecting you," Helena said gently. "There are those in your village who would have used that knowledge to hurt you both. Your father, for instance, has spent years trying to find ways to profit from his wife's former position. She made certain he never understood the full scope of her work." The casual revelation that her father had been scheming to exploit her mother's legacy hit Evelyn like a physical blow. All his talk of family honor and appropriate behavior, and he had been planning to trade on her mother's reputation for personal gain. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. "Because Lord Adrian wishes to offer you the same position your mother once held," Helena replied. "But unlike her arrangement, which was unofficial and conducted in secret, he wants to formalize the role, create a public position with clear authority and protections. Your village needs an official mediator, someone who can negotiate between human and supernatural concerns without the prejudice that comes from ignorance or fear. Evelyn set down her teacup with hands that shook only slightly. And he thinks I could do that? He thinks you could do that better than anyone else available, a new voice said from the doorway. Adrian entered without the dramatic flair she might have expected from someone of his reputation. He moved like a man comfortable in his own skin, though that skin was pale enough to suggest he truly did avoid sunlight. His dark hair was longer than current fashion dictated, and his clothes were well made but not ostentatious. Most surprisingly, he was handsome in a completely ordinary way, the kind of face that would blend into any crowd if not for the unnaturally intense focus of his attention. "Lady Evelyn," he said, offering a bow similar to Helena's, "thank you for accepting my invitation." "I haven't accepted anything yet," she replied, then immediately flushed at her own boldness. His smile was warm and entirely human. "An excellent point. Would you be willing to hear my proposal before making any decisions?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Your village operates under an ancient agreement that provides protection from supernatural threats in exchange for certain accommodations," he began, settling into a chair across from her with careful attention to maintaining appropriate distance. "That agreement has served everyone well for 5 centuries, but it was written in a time when human and supernatural populations rarely interacted directly. The modern world requires more nuanced arrangements." He gestured toward a bookshelf lined with what appeared to be legal texts and historical records. "I need someone who understands both communities to help renegotiate the terms of the pact. Someone who can speak for human interests without dismissing supernatural needs and who can command respect from both sides." "And you think that person is me?" Evelyn asked, still struggling to believe any of this was real. "I think that person could be you, with proper training and support," he corrected. "Your mother demonstrated remarkable skill in this area, and Helena's observations suggest you inherited her diplomatic instincts. But the choice must be entirely yours, made with full understanding of what the position entails." Helena cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should show her the library before continuing this discussion. Knowledge makes better decisions than speculation." The library turned out to be a revelation that left Evelyn speechless. 3 walls lined floor to ceiling with books, scrolls, and bound documents that spanned centuries of supernatural law, human history, and diplomatic precedent. The 4th wall was dominated by an enormous map marking territories, trade routes, and what appeared to be the locations of various supernatural communities throughout the region. "This is 500 years of accumulated knowledge about peaceful coexistence," Adrian explained, watching her awed expression with obvious satisfaction. "Your mother spent many evenings here, researching precedents for the disputes she mediated. I would like to offer you the same access, along with formal training in supernatural law and diplomatic protocol." Evelyn ran her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume titled Consensual Agreements Between Species, a Practical Guide. The very idea that such knowledge existed, that there were established procedures for the situations her village faced, made her head spin with possibility. "What would be expected of me?" she asked. "Initially, apprenticeship," Helena answered. 6 months of study to understand the legal frameworks, followed by supervised mediation of minor disputes to develop practical experience. If you prove capable and choose to continue, we would formally propose to your village council that you be recognized as official mediator with authority to negotiate on their behalf. "And compensation?" Evelyn asked, surprising herself with the practical question. Adrian's smile widened. "A salary equivalent to what the village's most successful merchant earns annually, plus housing in the east wing of the manor, plus access to resources for any projects you deem necessary for community welfare. Your independence would be complete. You could leave at any time, and your position would be subject to review by village vote every 3 years. The offer was so far beyond her wildest dreams that Evelyn had to sit down heavily in the nearest chair. Financial security, intellectual challenge, meaningful work, and the respect that came with official authority, everything she had never dared hope for, presented as a realistic possibility. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me, specifically?" Adrian exchanged a look with Helena before answering. "Because yesterday, when your father attempted to trade you away like property, You asked for time to consider your options instead of simply accepting or rejecting the situation. That instinct, to pause, evaluate, and insist on agency even under pressure, is the foundation of good diplomacy. Also, Helena added pragmatically, because the village has spent years telling you that you're worthless, which means you understand intimately how it feels to be dismissed and undervalued. That experience would make you a fierce advocate for anyone facing similar treatment. The truth of that observation hit Evelyn like a physical blow. All those years of being made to feel small and unwanted hadn't just been suffering. They had been education in empathy, training in understanding what people needed when they felt powerless. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Adrian replied immediately. "Take as much time as you need. The offer remains open, and there is no pressure to decide quickly." As Helena walked her back to the front door, Evelyn's mind buzzed with questions and possibilities. At the threshold, she turned back toward the library where Adrian still sat surrounded by centuries of knowledge. "If I said yes," she called out, "when would we start?" His smile was radiant. "Tomorrow, if you wish. There is much to learn, and your village will need a skilled mediator soon. Changes are coming whether we're prepared for them or not." The walk back down the hill passed in a blur of racing thoughts and cautious excitement. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt the strange sensation of anticipating the future instead of simply enduring it. But as the village lights came into view below, she realized that choosing her own path would mean confronting everyone who had spent years trying to convince her she didn't deserve to have one. And that confrontation was going to be far more dangerous than any supernatural negotiation. The first 3 weeks at the manor passed like a fever dream of discovery and transformation. Each morning, Evelyn climbed the hill with her mother's journal tucked safely in her pocket, and each evening she descended with her mind reeling from new knowledge. Helena proved to be a demanding but brilliant teacher, drilling her in the intricate protocols of supernatural law, while Adrian provided historical context that made the dry legal frameworks come alive with human stories. "Consent," Helena repeated for the 100th time as they reviewed a particularly complex trade agreement from the previous century, "is not merely saying yes. It requires understanding the full scope of what you're agreeing to, the power to refuse without consequences, and the ability to change your mind if circumstances shift." Evelyn absorbed these lessons with the hunger of someone who had spent years starving for intellectual challenge. The stone pendant at her throat seemed to grow warmer each day, as if responding to her growing confidence, and she found herself speaking with authority she had never possessed before. But the village's reaction to her transformation was far from universally positive. "Look at her, putting on airs," Martha whispered, loudly enough for half the marketplace to hear, as Evelyn passed on her way to purchase supplies for the manor's kitchen. 3 weeks with that creature, and she thinks she's too good for honest work. Evelyn paused, turned, and met Martha's eyes with steady calm. "Good morning, Martha. I hope your grandson's cough is improving. Helena mentioned that willow bark tea might help. I could bring some down from the manor's herb stores if you'd like." The offer, made without defensiveness or anger, clearly caught Martha off guard. She mumbled something non-committal and hurried away, leaving several other villagers staring at Evelyn with new speculation. That evening, her father confronted her with accusations that cut deeper than any marketplace gossip. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said, pacing their small kitchen like a caged animal, "and making a fool of me by extension. People are saying you've been seduced by dark magic, that you're losing your mind up there." "People say many things," Evelyn replied quietly, stirring the soup she was preparing, one of her mother's recipes that she had finally learned to make properly under Helena's patient instruction. "Most of them are based on fear rather than fact." "Don't use that tone with me," her father snapped. "I'm still your father, and I forbid you to continue this ridiculous charade." The word forbid hung in the air between them like a challenge. Evelyn set down her spoon and turned to face him fully, drawing on everything she had learned about negotiation and power dynamics. "Father," she said with gentle firmness, "I respect your concern for my welfare. But I am 22 years old. I am supporting myself financially, and I am making decisions about my own life based on careful consideration of the facts available to me. Your disapproval does not constitute grounds for forbidding anything." His face went purple with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "I am grateful," she interrupted smoothly, "for the home you provided and the food you put on this table. I am not grateful for being publicly humiliated and offered as payment for debts I didn't incur. There is a difference between gratitude and servitude, just as there is a difference between concern and control." The argument escalated from there, with her father making increasingly desperate threats and Evelyn responding with the kind of measured diplomacy that would have made her mother proud. But the real test of her new skills came 3 days later, when the village council called an emergency meeting to address what they termed the supernatural infiltration problem. Evelyn learned about the meeting from young Thomas, the baker's apprentice, who had always been kind to her despite his master's hostility. He found her in the manor's garden, where she was learning to identify the various protective herbs that grew in carefully planned arrangements around the property. "They're saying terrible things," he whispered urgently. "Master Gregory claims you've been enchanted, that the Lord of the Heights is using you to spy on the village. They want to invoke the old laws about consorting with evil spirits." The old laws. Evelyn had read about them in her crash course on village history. Archaic regulations that had been used centuries ago to exile anyone deemed spiritually compromised. They hadn't been invoked in living memory, but they technically remained on the books. "When is this meeting?" she asked, her mind already racing through possible responses. "Tonight, after the evening bells. They're holding it in the church hall so they can claim divine authority for whatever they decide." Evelyn thanked Thomas and immediately sought out Adrian, finding him in the library as usual, surrounded by thick legal tomes. When she explained the situation, his expression grew grim. "They're moving faster than I anticipated," he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "I had hoped to complete your training before attempting any formal negotiations with the council." "I don't think we have that luxury," Evelyn replied, surprised by her own calm. "If they exile me tonight, there won't be any negotiations to complete." Adrian studied her face with the intensity she had grown accustomed to over the past weeks. "Are you prepared to defend yourself publicly? Because once you speak before the council as my representative, there will be no going back to your old life. You will be choosing this path permanently." The weight of that choice settled on her shoulders, but instead of feeling crushing, it felt like putting on armor that finally fit properly. "I think I chose this path the night I walked up your hill," she said quietly. "Everything since then has just been learning how to walk it with dignity." That evening, the church hall buzzed with nervous energy as what seemed like half the village crowded into the pews. Evelyn entered through the main doors rather than slipping in quietly through the back, and she wore her mother's best dress, deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes and made the stone pendant visible at her throat. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some villagers looked at her with obvious hostility, others with curiosity, and a few, mostly women her own age, with something that might have been admiration. She had changed in the past 3 weeks, not just in confidence, but in bearing. The girl who used to hunch her shoulders and avoid eye contact had been replaced by a young woman who carried herself with quiet authority. Master Gregory, the village's self-appointed moral guardian, called the meeting to order with more ceremony than usual. "We are gathered tonight," he announced in his most sonorous voice, "to address a threat to our spiritual welfare and physical safety. One among us has been corrupted by dark influences and now serves as an agent of evil in our midst." Evelyn remained seated until he finished his dramatic opening, then stood and walked calmly to the front of the hall. The simple act of claiming space without permission caused a ripple of shocked murmurs. "Master Gregory," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room, "before you continue with accusations, perhaps we should establish what exactly constitutes corruption and evil in your estimation. Are you referring to my education in legal precedents, my training in diplomatic protocol, or simply my refusal to accept public humiliation as appropriate treatment?" The directness of her challenge clearly caught him off guard. He had expected defensive denials, not a calm request for clarification. "You consort with creatures of darkness," he sputtered. You spend your days in a den of supernatural evil, learning unnatural arts that no decent woman should know. I study law, Evelyn replied matter-of-factly. I learn about the agreements that have protected this village for 5 centuries. I practice the same diplomatic skills my mother used to resolve disputes between families. Which specific aspect of this education do you consider unnatural or evil? From the back of the room, a voice called out, "What about the blood drinking? Everyone knows vampires feed on human souls." Evelyn had been prepared for this question. "An excellent point," she said, turning to address the entire assembly rather than just Gregory. "Lord Adrian does require blood for sustenance, just as we require grain and meat. But like us, he obtains his food through voluntary exchange rather than violence. Those who choose to provide this service are compensated generously and protected by binding agreements that ensure their safety and welfare." Compensated? Martha's voice was sharp with incredulous shock. "You mean people are paid for that?" "Of course," Evelyn replied calmly. "Why would anyone expect such an intimate service to be provided without fair compensation? The arrangement is no different from any other trade agreement, except that it includes more extensive protections for the provider." This revelation caused a stir throughout the hall. The idea that supernatural interactions might involve mundane business arrangements rather than mystical corruption was clearly not what most people had expected to hear. Master Gregory regained his footing quickly. "Regardless of these explanations," he said with obvious distaste, "the fact remains that you have violated the natural order by placing yourself under the authority of an inhuman creature. The old laws are clear about the consequences for such behavior." "The old laws," Evelyn agreed pleasantly, "are indeed clear. They specify that exile can only be imposed for willing service to entities that threaten the community's welfare. Which raises 2 important questions. First, do you have evidence that Lord Adrian threatens our welfare? And second, do you have authority to make that determination without consulting the ancient pact itself?" The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn had just challenged not only Gregory's accusations, but his right to make them without proper legal grounds. "I have spent 3 weeks studying the actual terms of our agreement with Lord Adrian," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The pact specifies that disputes regarding supernatural interactions must be mediated by someone trained in both human and supernatural law. It also states that any attempt to dissolve the agreement requires formal negotiation with all affected parties present." She paused to let that sink in, then delivered the blow that changed everything. "Master Gregory, you are attempting to invoke legal authority you do not possess to punish behavior that violates no actual laws. In doing so, you are placing this village in breach of the ancient pact, which could result in the loss of all supernatural protections we have enjoyed for 5 centuries. The implications of that statement hit the room like a physical wave. Without supernatural protection, the village would be vulnerable to threats they had forgotten existed in the safety of their long covenant. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her mother's diplomatic instincts guiding her words, "I am prepared to offer this community something it has never had before: formal representation in supernatural affairs, transparent negotiation processes, and the establishment of clear protocols for any villager who wishes to engage in voluntary trade with supernatural entities." The offer was brilliant tactical maneuvering. Instead of simply defending herself, she was proposing benefits that would improve everyone's situation. An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. "What kind of benefits are we talking about?" "Improved crop yields through supernatural weather modification," Evelyn replied immediately. "Protection from bandits and wild animals. Access to healing knowledge that could save lives during harsh winters. Economic opportunities through trade in rare goods. All of it conducted through formal agreements that protect human interests while acknowledging supernatural needs." Master Gregory's face had gone from purple to pale as he realized that his attempt to destroy Evelyn's reputation was instead making her sound like the solution to problems the village hadn't even known it could solve. "You're talking about deals with the devil," he said desperately. "I'm talking about the same kind of agreements we make with traveling merchants," Evelyn corrected. The only difference is that some of our trading partners happen to have supernatural abilities, which, properly managed, could benefit everyone significantly. The tide of opinion in the room was shifting visibly. What had started as a condemnation was turning into something that looked suspiciously like a job interview. Young Thomas stood up in the back. "What would you need from us to make this work?" "Recognition of my position as official mediator," Evelyn replied. "Authority to negotiate on the village's behalf, and a commitment to approach supernatural interactions with open minds rather than inherited prejudices." "And in return?" asked the woman who ran the village's only inn. "Transparent reporting of all agreements, regular community meetings to discuss concerns and opportunities, and a guarantee that no villager will ever be forced into supernatural service against their will." The last point was aimed directly at Master Gregory's earlier accusations, but it also served as a promise that the kind of public humiliation she had endured would never happen to anyone else. The formal vote was almost anticlimactic after the dramatic confrontation. When Master Gregory called for all those opposed to Evelyn's proposal to raise their hands, fewer than a dozen responded. When he reluctantly called for supporters, the overwhelming majority of the hall stood up. As the meeting dispersed, Evelyn found herself surrounded by villagers who had never spoken to her directly before. Some had questions about specific supernatural services they might be interested in. Others simply wanted to thank her for standing up to Master Gregory's bullying. A few young women asked quietly if there might be opportunities for them to receive the kind of education she had gotten. But the most meaningful moment came when her father approached her near the church doors, his face a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "I don't understand what you've become," he said quietly, "but I can see that you found something I never could have given you." "I've found my voice," Evelyn replied simply. Mother always said it was there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. 6 months later, the village had transformed as dramatically as Evelyn herself. The manor's east wing had been converted into offices where she held regular consultation hours for anyone with supernatural-related concerns. A small but thriving trade had developed in rare herbs and crafted goods that commanded premium prices in distant markets. Most importantly, the old culture of fear and whispered superstitions had given way to practical curiosity about their supernatural neighbors. Evelyn stood in the manor's garden on the anniversary of that first fateful night, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The stone pendant at her throat had grown warm again, but now she understood why. It responded to moments of profound contentment, marking the times when she felt most fully herself. "Admiring your handiwork?" Adrian's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and respect that had grown over months of working partnership. "Admiring the view," she replied, turning to smile at him. Their relationship had evolved beyond the formal boundaries of supernatural law into something deeper and more complex. Not quite romance, but a connection that transcended the usual categories. "And thinking about how strange it is that the worst day of my life led to the best decision I ever made. Your mother would be proud," he said quietly, settling beside her on the garden bench where they often conducted their evening discussions. "I hope so," Evelyn murmured. "I think she knew this day would come, even when I was too afraid to imagine it myself." As the first stars appeared overhead, the village bell tolled the hour. Not a summons or a warning, but simply the peaceful marking of time's passage. The sound no longer carried the weight of fear or obligation, but rather the promise of another day in a community that had learned to embrace its own power to choose. In the distance, lights began to appear in cottage windows as families gathered for evening meals, secure in protections they finally understood and governed by agreements they had helped to shape. And in the manor's east wing, Evelyn's office waited for tomorrow's challenges, equipped with centuries of knowledge and the hard-won wisdom that true strength comes not from being chosen by others, but from learning to choose yourself.